The wind howled outside as young Ethan huddled in his room, the walls of his family home echoing memories that felt both close and so painfully out of reach. It had been almost a year since the tragic accident that took his parents from him, and though the world continued to spin, Ethan felt frozen in time. At 17, he was still navigating the grief of loss while trying to understand the implications of his new reality. In this new world, Ethan was not just a grieving son but a ward of the state, his parents' wishes no longer guiding him but instead pointing him toward a woman he barely knew, Aunt Judy. Having long been estranged from his father's side of the family, Aunt Judy's name alone stirred confusion and resentment deep within him. How could someone he didn't know be his guardian? Ethan's thoughts twisted like the storm outside. He had heard faint conversations about Aunt Judy over the years, whispers of disagreements and family rifts, arguments neither he nor his younger sister, now lost in the fog of a younger mind, could possibly understand. But now that they were gone, Judy was his only link to the paternal side of his family. Desperate to cling to any semblance of consistency, he had hoped she would bring comfort and support. Instead, Aunt Judy stormed into his life like a whirlwind, her overbearing nature suffocating. The minute he set foot in her home, it became clear, she had ideas on how to fix him. "You're not going to be just like your father," she announced, as if he were already teetering on the edge of becoming a man she deemed unworthy. Her voice dripped with judgment, and each word felt like a sting. She presented unyielding rules and surged promises of a better life that suffocated the remnants of his parents' love. Gary, her husband, tried to intervene, offering kind words and a gentle smile, but even he seemed to buckle beneath Aunt Judy's relentless control. Ethan felt caught in a vice, trapped between two adults, one who fawned and one who commanded. He would watch as Gary timidly tiptoed on the edges of their arguments, powerless against the storm that was Judy. No amount of coaxing from him seemed to settle her. After several weeks, their weekly ritual of returning to scrub the memories from his old home became his lifeline. Cleaning felt like preservation. He held on to remnants of his parents in the small things, the worn chair where his mother always plopped down after work, a photo of their family on the fridge. But Aunt Judy's comments gnawed at him relentlessly, especially during those visits, tainting what should have been comforting. One day, as they stood in the living room, he organized photos while Aunt Judy rifled through his father's belongings, preparing to discard items she deemed unnecessary. Ethan felt the fury bubble within him as she gestured toward a modest gun safe containing his father's hunting memorabilia. "This can go," she said casually, as if ripping apart a connection to the love of his life was as simple as throwing away trash. "No, you can't," Ethan shouted, the words erupting from him with surprising force. Judy's eyes widened, and for a moment, silence filled the air, thick and unyielding. "I am your guardian, and I can." "You're not my parent," he spat, his heart pounding. "You don't get to decide what goes. Everything here is part of who they were." Gary, who had been in the kitchen, stepped in, his face pale. "Judy, I think we should." "No, Gary. He's just a child still learning, needing guidance," she interrupted, turning the argument, as usual, back toward authority. But Ethan was no longer willing to cower. Feeling empowered by his own voice, he called his grandparents on impulse. It was a lifeline he hadn't expected but desperately wanted. They arrived before dusk, a steady comfort against the panic that was growing inside him. When they confronted Judy, he heard the words he needed to hear, wrapping around him like a warm blanket. "You better treat him with respect, Judy. This is not your show," his grandmother's voice resonated. As Judy backed off, Ethan could sense the change. For now, he had claimed his space. Aunt Judy could not stomp through his life like she owned him, shoving family roots into the ground that were not hers to control. He clung tightly to the sense of empowerment that now buoyed him. But as they left, uncertainty thrummed through him. Had he severed ties too aggressively? Would he forever be lost in a family tree that now seemed so tangled? Little did Ethan know, the decision to resist would ripple into deeper waters than he expected. In the days that followed, Aunt Judy proved not to be the only storm on the horizon. As the rain began to subside, Ethan felt the weight of his choices pressing upon him. Was standing up for himself the right decision? Or had he started a cascade that could bring more harm than good? The blurs of the past were still wrapped around him, and the clouds of his present hung heavy with uncertainty. What had he set into motion? Unbeknownst to him, Aunt Judy would not let the matter rest so easily, and the battles ahead stretched further than he could anticipate. He would soon discover that sometimes mere blood ties are not enough to seal the bond of family, and when one door opens, another may not always lead to safety. As the rain began to subside, Ethan felt the weight of his choices pressing upon him. Was standing up for himself the right decision? Or had he started a cascade that could bring more harm than good? The blurs of the past were still wrapped around him, and the clouds of his present hung heavy with uncertainty. What had he set into motion? Unbeknownst to him, Aunt Judy would not let the matter rest so easily, and the battles ahead stretched further than he could anticipate. That evening, as he prepared for bed, a sense of foreboding settled over him like a gloomy fog. Would Aunt Judy try to take advantage of the small victory he'd had, turning it into another power play? His thoughts raced back to their heated confrontation earlier in the day. The image of her puffed-up anger and defiant stance flashed through his mind. For the first time, he felt the satisfaction of claiming his space, but he wondered, at what cost? The feeling of standing his ground quickly faded as anxiety washed over him like the lingering summer rain outside. Just as he lay down to sleep, the phone buzzed from his bedside table. Startled, he reached for it, half expecting a message from Gary, who had been a silent support since he moved in with Aunt Judy. But the name that flashed on the screen made his heart race. It was Aunt Judy. Taking a deep breath, he opened the message. "I'm coming over tomorrow. We need to talk." Panic surged within him, and the room felt suddenly stifling. What did that mean? Did she plan to confront him about the call he made to his grandparents? Was she plotting her next move? He tossed and turned throughout the night, chasing the shadow of his thoughts. The next day, dread loomed larger than life as he prepared for what lay ahead. He found it hard to focus on the routine of getting ready for school, his mind a jumble of anxiety and resolve. When he arrived home later that afternoon, the air thickened as he realized Aunt Judy's car was parked outside. Ethan's stomach tightened into a knot, and for a moment, he considered turning around and leaving. But he steeled himself, reminding himself of the authority he had found in his earlier confrontation. Stepping inside, he found Aunt Judy already inside, seated in the living room with an air of authority. The fire crackled in the hearth, but the warmth of the flames did little to chase away the unease that had settled around them. She looked up as he entered, her expression stern yet steely, like a general ready to launch into battle. "Ethan," she began, her voice measured and cold, "I think it's time we had a real conversation about boundaries." "Boundaries?" he echoed, his brow furrowing. "You mean your boundaries, right? The ones where you try to control every part of my life." "Control?" She scoffed, leaning back in her chair, crossing her arms defiantly. "I'm here to guide you. Your parents." "Don't bring them into this," he interrupted, his voice firmer than he had anticipated. "They're not here to defend themselves, and frankly, you don't know them." Aunt Judy's expression flickered, a hint of hurt bleeding through the anger. "I'm trying to help you avoid the mistakes they made. If you think you know better, you're going to end up." "End up what?" "Like you," he shot back, the words erupting before he could restrain them. "Controlling. Angry. I don't want to be like that. I'm trying to figure things out, not become your version of perfection." A silence hung between them, thick and suffocating. Ethan's heart raced, aware that he was playing with fire. Would she see the truth in his words, or would he become a target of her wrath once more? After a moment, Aunt Judy took a deep breath, her defiance wavering for the first time. "I don't want to hurt you," she said, her voice tinged with genuine concern. "I'm just so angry, and it's been hard to navigate all of this, the loss, and the past." Ethan's defenses softened, if only slightly. He could feel the tumult of emotion swirling in the air, unacknowledged grief masked by a facade of control. "I get that it's hard," he replied quietly, "but trying to change who I am won't help either of us heal." For the first time, Aunt Judy faltered visibly, her rigid posture loosening. "Then what do you suggest?" she asked, the sharpness in her tone replaced with a tentative vulnerability. "I want to talk about what it means to be family," Ethan said, his heart racing as he considered his next words. "I don't need someone to dictate my life. I need someone to help me understand what being part of a family means now that ours is gone." Tears glistened in Aunt Judy's eyes, and for a moment, both of them sat in silence. Was this a breakthrough, or merely a pause before the next storm? "I thought the only way to hold it together was to impose rules," she admitted. "But maybe I just need to listen. Maybe I need help too." As if a dam had broken between them, Ethan felt the tension slowly dissipate. They began to talk slowly, sharing stories, memories, laughter, and, yes, tears. It was raw and imperfect but real. They were both feeling lost in a world that had upended their lives. Yet, deep within him, Ethan felt the reserve still holding him back. While their conversation granted a brief pause in the tempest, he knew the storms of Aunt Judy's control weren't over. She still held power over him, making every decision. He was still legally a minor beneath her guardianship. And if her anger ignited again, could he truly rely on her to support him, or would she instead bury him under her unmet expectations? The next day brought clarity, but it also brought the realization that the war wasn't over. Later that afternoon, Ethan received a phone call from Gary, who had become something of a beacon of hope for him. He answered, eager to hear the voice that had shown him love and support, a sharp contrast to Aunt Judy's recent domineering nature. After exchanging pleasantries, Gary's voice dipped into seriousness as he said, "Ethan, I need to talk to you about something important regarding Judy, and I think it's time we set up a plan to protect you." Ethan's heart dropped at the words. He felt his hands tremble, but he knew one thing for certain: the battle for his autonomy and identity was just beginning, and he wasn't alone. Ethan's heart dropped at the words. He felt his hands tremble, but he knew one thing for certain: the battle for his autonomy and identity was just beginning, and he wasn't alone. "Protect me," Ethan echoed, a whirlwind of emotion stirring within him. He looked around the living room, the once comforting spaces now feeling laden with tension. "What do you mean?" Gary took a deep breath, his voice steady but filled with concern. "Judy's behavior. I've noticed changes, and I'm worried she might not accept the boundaries we talked about. I think it's time we consider all options for your safety and well-being." The air in the room felt heavy, as if it were charged with the electricity of uncertainty. Ethan swallowed hard, a knot forming in his throat. "What options?" "Legal guardianship," Gary replied. "Your grandparents are concerned, and they want to ensure you're protected from her controlling behavior. They're on your side in this, and, well, I think it might be wise to discuss possible restraining orders if things escalate." Ethan's mind raced at the thought. Restraining orders sounded like a drastic measure, one that would create more conflict. Yet, a deeper instinct within him whispered that it might be necessary. The thought of Aunt Judy pushing against the boundaries he was trying to establish frightened him, and the idea of losing control of his life again felt unbearable. "Isn't that a bit extreme?" Ethan questioned, trying to grasp the implications of it all. "I mean, she's still my family." "Yes, but family doesn't always mean safe," Gary said, his voice filled with warmth but firm in its resolve. "You deserve to feel secure in your home and in your life. It's crucial to put your well-being first." Ethan let the words sink in, a mix of relief and fear washing over him. The world of legalities was foreign territory, and navigating it felt daunting. He needed to take charge before Aunt Judy's reign suffocated him completely. "But how?" "I don't want to be a burden," he finally said, uncertainty bleeding through his voice. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. If I hadn't called my grandparents, maybe things would have been different." "No, Ethan," Gary interjected gently. "This isn't your fault. If anything, by standing up for yourself, you're doing exactly what you need to do. Family is supposed to be a support system, not a battleground. You deserve to live without fear." Ethan took a breath, sensing the scales tip slowly toward being honest with himself. He couldn't ignore the weight that Aunt Judy's constraints placed upon him. He thought of the moments when she tried to change his habits, where her relentless need for control began to invade every corner of his life. Would he ever reclaim the sense of self he lost amidst her expectations? "All right," he said, summoning the courage he hadn't known he possessed. "Let's do it. Let's talk to my grandparents about setting up the legal guardianship. I want to take charge of my life." "Good," Gary replied, a hint of admiration in his voice. "Meet me at the cafe tomorrow. I'll help you prepare for the talk with them, and we can outline how we'll take the next steps." After they hung up, Ethan's heart raced, but this time, it was different. He felt empowered, a shift in the narrative finally within his control. The next morning, he woke up with determination coursing through his veins. He eagerly anticipated the cafe meeting. The prospect of collaboration felt like stepping into sunlight after a lengthy storm. As Ethan arrived at the cafe, the aroma of fresh coffee engulfed him, invigorating him further. Gary was already inside, waiting at their usual table. He waved as Ethan approached, a welcoming smile gracing his face. "Ready?" Gary asked, his tone upbeat but serious. "More than ever," Ethan replied, the words flowing with newfound confidence. As they settled into the conversation, Ethan outlined his thoughts and feelings, the events of the past weeks pouring from him like a long-held breath released. Gary was attentive, nodding along, and taking notes as Ethan articulated his concerns about Aunt Judy and her controlling nature. Let's get into the details of what your grandparents can help set up, Gary suggested after Ethan finished. We'll want to lay a strong foundation, so it's clear what's at stake if Judy continues her behavior. The two spent over an hour working through the various aspects of guardianship, discussing everything from the importance of a healthy support system to the legal nuances that would ensure Ethan's safety and autonomy. With each topic they covered, Ethan felt a growing sense of control, the knots in his stomach steadily loosening. Later that afternoon, he met with his maternal grandparents, their faces lighting up at the sight of him. He could tell by the tenderness in their eyes that they were worried, but they stood as pillars of strength when he explained his plan. They listened intently as he outlined the steps he and Gary had discussed. "We're so proud of you, Ethan," his grandmother said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's not easy to stand up for yourself and advocate for your well-being." "I just want to feel safe," he replied, feeling the weight of vulnerability crumbling his facade. "I want to be able to remember my parents fondly, all the good things. I can't do that if Aunt Judy is trying to erase them." After all their discussion, Ethan and his grandparents decided on a plan. They agreed to reach out to a family law attorney who could help them build a case for legal guardianship. His grandfather vowed to contact the attorney while his grandmother promised to be his advocate throughout the entire process, ready to stand behind him. As the evening light poured through the windows, Ethan looked around at the familiar warmth of his grandparents' home, feeling a sense of hope wash over him. He knew it would not be easy. Aunt Judy would not take this lightly. But as his mind set on the challenges ahead, he also felt poised at the brink of something new. The thought of actively reshaping his life lit a fire inside him. He was no longer just a boy amid a storm. He was becoming the captain, steering his own ship. Little did he know, Aunt Judy, ever watchful, was brewing her own counterattack. Determination sparkled in her eyes. The winds of change were blowing, but not all gusts were gentle, and the next clash loomed ominously on the horizon. Ethan took a deep breath, glancing at his grandparents who were discussing the attorney's recommendations. Whatever the future held, he had allies now. He had a voice. And with that voice, he would not allow anyone to drown him out, especially not Aunt Judy. The journey ahead might be complicated, but he was ready to fight for his own peace of mind, determined to reclaim the narrative that had begun to slip away from him. Ethan took a deep breath, glancing at his grandparents, who were discussing the attorney's recommendations. Whatever the future held, he had allies now. He had a voice. And with that voice, he would not allow anyone to drown him out, especially not Aunt Judy. The journey ahead might be complicated, but he was ready to fight for his peace of mind, determined to reclaim the narrative that had begun to slip away from him. Days turned into a blur as the plan took shape. Meetings with the attorney became routine, and each discussion fortified his resolve. His grandparents stood by him unwaveringly, their love insulating him against the anxiety that bubbled just below the surface. The moments when doubt crept in took a backseat to the moments when he could envision himself free from the weight of Aunt Judy's control. The upcoming court date loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon, but as he mentally prepared, he could feel a budding strength within him. During dinner conversations, he began to share stories about his parents freely, recounting cherished memories that had been overshadowed by grief and Aunt Judy's oppressive feelings. He felt warmth wrap around him as his grandparents listened, chuckling at the funny moments and wiping edges of nostalgia from their eyes. They shared their stories too, forging a bond that felt unbreakable. Ethan grasped the power of connection, the importance of family, not in a controlling sense, but in a loving, accepting one. But, as the days grew closer, the shadows around Aunt Judy were also starting to deepen. Word of the guardianship talk had reached her, and she was not about to retreat quietly. The day before the court hearing was a whirlwind of emotions. As Ethan sat in his room, surrounded by scattered notes and belongings, a loud knock echoed through the house. His heart raced as he exchanged glances with his grandparents, instantly knowing what was coming. "Ethan!" Aunt Judy's voice boomed. "Open the door now." He hesitated but steeled himself against the mounting anxiety. Gathering every ounce of courage, he shouted back, "I can't talk right now." "I'll decide when we talk," she countered, her tone cold and uncompromising. "You can't hide behind your grandparents forever, you know." Ethan felt the walls closing in, but he refused to give in to her intimidation. His grandparents' comforting presence bolstered his strength. They quietly approached, grandmother gently but firmly placing a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to do this alone," she murmured. Aunt Judy persisted, her voice climbing a notch higher, tinged with defiance. "You're making a mistake, Ethan. You're throwing away your family." "Family?" Ethan couldn't keep the quiver out of his voice. Family means trusting each other, not controlling each other. I want my life back. There was a moment of silence on the other side of the door, and the air hung thick with tension. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he braced himself for her reply. No matter how hard you try, you can't run from your past. You can't erase what your parents did, Aunt Judy yelled, her frustration spilling over. You'll regret this. With those words hanging in the air, Ethan felt a surge of emotions battle within him. Regret. Did he truly allow her to fester doubt in his heart? Would he really allow that? No, he muttered more to himself than to her. I won't regret choosing my autonomy. I have to do this. Ethan, his grandmother urged empathetically. Stay strong, honey. Remember, you're taking control of your future. The silence was heavy, and Ethan could hear Aunt Judy's annoyed huff from outside. He felt a surge of defiance wash over him. I am not afraid of the truth, he announced boldly, surprising himself with the confidence in his voice. Suddenly, he heard footsteps retreating, and relief flooded through him. In the shift of silence, his breath staggered before he released it all at once, suddenly exhausted yet exhilarated. That evening, Ethan found solace in his grandparents' kitchen. They spent time cooking together, creating a familiar comfort in the chaos. The laughter shared over mixing ingredients and the joy of homemade cookies reminded him of the resilience that family could truly represent, a family bonded through love, not control. The following morning, Ethan stood before the mirror, his reflection reflecting a mix of anxiety and determination. Clad in a simple yet respectful outfit, he could sense the changelessness of the old, echoing thoughts of inadequacy begin to peel away. As they drove to the courthouse, silence filled the car, but there was an unspoken understanding shared among them. They stood united, determined against any storm Aunt Judy could summon. Reaching the courthouse steps, Ethan's determination solidified further. Taking a breath, he stepped forward, his grandparents on either side lending unwavering support. Inside, the navigator of his life felt like it was finally turning toward a brighter path. When the gavel finally came down in favor of his grandparents, Ethan couldn't suppress the wave of relief that crashed over him. Their fight had secured his voice where Aunt Judy's shadow had loomed large. He had finally pushed through the fog of doubt, emerging on the other side. As they walked out into the afternoon light, tears streaming down his grandmother's face mixed with laughter and relief. They shared warm hugs, Ethan feeling a weight lift entirely from his chest. It was over, or at least, so he hoped. But as they turned the corner, he caught sight of Aunt Judy, her expression a lethal mix of disbelief and fury. You think this is over, don't you? She shouted, her fury choking the air around them. You're nothing without me. For a fleeting moment, panic gripped him, but then came the warmth of his grandparents' hands on his shoulders and the strength of all they'd gone through together. He met her gaze squarely, realizing that it was her wrath, not his, that drove the storm. I am everything I choose to be, Ethan declared, the conviction in his voice stronger than ever. I'm done living under the shadow of your control. You might be my family, Aunt Judy, but that doesn't mean I have to let you dictate my life. As they moved forward, Ethan felt a fierce sense of liberation wash over him. It didn't matter how Aunt Judy reacted, he was ready to chart his course. Whatever storms remained would no longer have the power to drown out his light. And in that moment, he embraced the future, full of possibility. The adventure of finding himself not just as someone's nephew, but as Ethan, a whole and complete being ready to live life on his own terms.